Okay, off another disappointing season for the Brooklyn Nets. Should fans be concerned that owner Joe Tsai will be moving in a different direction this offseason? Money has been spent. Has the return on investment warranted doubling and nay tripling down on what this team needs to do in order to finally bring a championship? We break it all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes, it's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, DraftKings, FanDuel. He's got you covered. He's also going to be Blue Check Certified Fresh over on Twitter. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the epic New York Football Giants draft class incoming.
Ooh, baby.
Over. That's right. On the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And I tell you what, man, we're going to dive in on a lot of the different angles here around Joseph Tsai, an article that came out, obviously, in conjunction between a couple of writers at the New York Post. But the offseason, as we've said, we feel confident now about this, Doug, is not going to lack for storylines around this team because arguably it's as big as any offseason they're going to have, which sounds insane to say.
Yeah, look, it's in some ways you feel good about it because you got Kevin Durant under contract for the foreseeable future. That was the big thing, but there's just it's really kind of after that only question marks. I would say, even among the stars. I mean, I could put a question mark on just about everybody on the roster. This is something we're going to dive in a little bit later in the week. We'll talk to Chris Mahalan from Nets Daily. We're going to break down a lot of this roster turnover. But when you have this many questions, what you kind of don't want to hear is that money might be a problem. And that is possibly what happened here this week with a very early article written by Josh Kosman and Brian Lewis from the New York Post that went into really great detail. Well, great is going to be the operative word. It went into a lot of detail, depending on if you like the detail or not. That's going to be up for a debate. But it went into detail around a lot of just the financials around the Nets and specifically owner Joseph Tsai. And we'll go through some of the specifics here. I would just get out ahead of this a little bit and say, when you start hearing money problem articles that did not just appear out of thin air, it wasn't like these guys are fine reporters, right? But it's like, it wasn't like, I got an idea, let's do this. It's like, nah, we got some sourcing here that tells us that people are not happy. I mean, they go into detail on it. We'll go through that. But when you hear an article like this coming out prior to free agency, like right prior to the draft, prior to free agency, in an offseason that we know is going to be monumentally important for the Brooklyn Nets to make kind of all the right moves here to make sure they can secure some, possible championship equity. Do you get worried when you see some of these tea leaves like this? Because I thought, well, I kind of know what this means. We'll go through each a couple of these numbers, but when you see an article like this by these guys with possibly someone crying, with their hands going into their pockets and turning those pockets inside out, does it make you worried about like the trajectory of the team?
I do think you have to look at it and say, because all these numbers are known, right? It's not like, hey, dude, what happened with the Nets? Like, what was the luxury tax? Like, did they really have to pay a lot when they signed extra players, when they gave out the big contracts? Like, these things were known. And to your point, it's not coming off of winning. And even if it was coming off winning a championship, it would still signal something just in a different way. What this signals right now is, again, for better or worse, 3 years into this journey, the results have not been there, and it's a double down. The results haven't been there on the court, but they also haven't been there off the court. Like there's two sides of this when you talk about Joe Tsai as a businessman who's looking to see money come back in, and the failings on the court do have a direct impact as to how far and how much you can expect to get a return on your investment. So, yeah, I think it has to at least be a signal of some kind. We've heard this from owners in sports over the years, right? When you start to hear these things get said, I'll use Yankees is a great example. There was a time a handful of years ago where they reframed expectations about how much money they would spend, staying below the tax threshold, not going over, right? Not overspending. We're not just going to buy championships anymore. And they stuck to that for the most part. Still have a really big payroll, but it reframed how you expect that team to spend and how you expect the ownership group to look at the GM and the manager and the players and say, this is what it is. Now you need to reward me for what I've done to this point.
Exactly. And that's exactly how I read this also, is that this is a little bit of a warning from the ownership to kind of everyone in the organization. And it's a little bit of a wake-up call around, look, Joe Tsai is a billionaire many times over. Okay, great. You do not get to be a billionaire by losing money every single year on your transactions. Like that is math that just doesn't compute, right? Yes. Can he afford to lose more than the average I can't even say that with a laugh.
It's always, I know, it's always a worry.
Anything, of course, but that's just not part of their DNA. So let's go through some of these. Let's go through some of these numbers. The article's a good one. It's worth to go check out. I'll put the link in the show notes. It's from, like I said, Josh Kosman and Brian Lewis. It's on the New York Post. The first alarming stat, the Nets and Barclays Center lost, and Joe Tsai's group owns the Barclays Center, lost between $50 and $100 million combined on the 2021-22 season, giving Tsai perhaps the worst financial losses in the NBA, sources with close knowledge of the situation told the Post. So right off the bat, you get between the team and what's happening with the Barclays Center, because owning that means those either revenue or losses count against you. The team lost, by some estimates, you can go up to $100 million this season, or those ownership groups. Secondly, Tsai will need to personally invest about $30 million this year for Barclays to make its municipal bond payments. I'm quoting the article here, after paying $52 million the prior year. That's from a Moody's report. So that's an $82 million combined and I'm sure that's factored a little into the losses here. So I'm not going to double count those numbers. Like some of that 82, maybe all that 82 is relative to the losses because you're not being able to pay the bond payment with revenue. No matter which way you shake it, it's a staggering loss. Then you get into like luxury tax, which we'll talk about. Like when you start hearing these numbers thrown around, like this to me feels like, hey, fans, just to let you know, fans, like we are losing money every year. And I know everyone wants us to go into the offseason with an open and blank checkbook, as most fandoms want to. But maybe that's not going to happen because at some point you just can't keep throwing possible good money after bad if that's the way Joe Tsai looks at how the organization is built right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the big factors in this is you talk about the losses and the expectations on, again, the money being invested, where coming into this, would we think that we'd be sitting here saying the Nets had won one playoff series, right, and went out on a sweep the following year at the hands of the Boston Celtics, as we know? And I mean, I'm pulling this information. I'll drill down on some harder numbers. This is going back a number of years here where they referenced the Miami Heat, saying that the Miami Heat, on average, 2013 playoffs, they were probably pulling in north of almost $1.5 million per game in the postseason by being in the playoffs. So for your home games. And if you come into this and you're Joe Tsai, you anticipate we probably get 8 to 12 home games per postseason, almost at a minimum here. So when you do the math on that, that takes the loss. You say he's going to eat a $30 million loss. Okay, I can chop that number in half, if not more, just by meeting expectations that we had for this team that I put together. So that factor in and of itself, and this is right, wrong, and different. It's the reality. So now if you're Joe Tsai sitting here, I do start to wonder, at what point do you think he looks at it and says, well, in theory, the money to be made still exists there, and yet I have not made that money to this point. And there's always going to be the cost versus return. And if I could spend significantly less, while it may bring down the quote unquote, total earnings, the profit margin could increase here. And that's where I think this article continues to push you in the direction of thinking.
And if you're Joe Tsai, you're looking at this, and if you're just looking at this analytically or financially, you say to yourself, just take that. That's a good number that you pulled for the Heat, right? So let's just take that as something like a proxy. He might look at that and say, not only did we not get that, we didn't even come close. We didn't even come close to getting it. We got swept out of the first round. it was not. Maybe they can win game one. I don't think anyone can make the claim that would have probably swayed the series all that much. They were completely dominated. I got one guy who I can't totally trust now because Ben Simmons, who knows? I think he's going to play. He's $33 million on the books right now. I don't know if he's going to play. So you look at this team and say, oh yeah, in a different world, could we get 12 home games? You can't look at this team and think confidently about it. Again, they just got completely smoked by the Celtics, who didn't break a sweat. So I think if you're looking at it from that point of view, and if you're just going strictly dollars and cents, you could see why you'd start to have these concerns. Again, we're not going to be in the business here of spending someone else's money. It's just the reality of the situation. And when you put like, again, I can't frame this enough. These articles don't just appear out of thin air because some writer was bored and just looking for something to write on that day, right? Like these are guys that cover the New York sports scene. They understand the dynamics of it. They have connections. These people have told them things that are very clear within the organization, whether it didn't come sourced from Tsai itself. It does not need to. These are things can be mostly just publicly known, and they're all put together into a framework that shows that not only are the results not there on the court for the Nets, but they're not there in the pocketbook either. Right. and that's when you're a businessman, that is the worst case scenario. There's nothing to brag about, and there's no money, and you don't get the bragging rights, and you don't get to finance something else. Again, not like he needs that money necessarily, but it doesn't matter because that's not the way these guys think. All right, I'm going to tell you in a second why, on a player standpoint, this is actually even more concerning heading in to the offseason for the Brooklyn Nets, and why fans aren't just going to want to let this article just kind of skate by them, what it could mean. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Got to love this site. We love Prize Picks. It's just because it's super easy. If you're going into some of these other operators out there, you're trying to do player props that are kind of impossible to find. The odds are kind of always moving around. You might not be able to get it in time. Here on Prize Picks, it's not the problem. It's super easy. You just go to pick 2 to 5 players. You go the over under on their projections, and you can win up to 10x. That's 10 times, and it's just you versus the projected numbers. You're not up against all these sharks in the water on some of these DFS sites. It's just you versus the Prize Picks numbers. You can make an entry in up to or less than 60 seconds. It's super easy. They offer super fast withdrawals that sometimes can be a problem with some of these other operators. On Prize Picks, you can mix sports. Maybe the NBA, you get points scored, rebounds, steals. Maybe you throw in a little MLB with it as well. And when NFL comes around, forget about it. Prize Picks got you covered there. Also, for a limited time, Prize Picks has an exclusive, total no-brainer of an offer. For all of our users, you can get $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. That's pretty easy. But you have to use the promo code NBA. That's right. Exclusive offer just for those Locked On fans out there. Sign up today. Use code NBA for $50 free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
And of course, we thank you for making us, the Locked On Nets podcast, your first listen every single day. You can make sure to go check out the Locked On NBA Big Board as well, because host Rafael Barlow, love him, been on the show, great guy from the NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter, is joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look into the NBA draft, mock draft, player rankings, and of course, the big boards. It's free and available everywhere you get your podcasts. Now, before you talk about player impact here, Doug, I did just want to bring up one thing as well. We talk in terms of return on the investment here for Joe Tsai. Another factor inside of this is when you spend the money and you get the big stars here. One of the easy one-to-ones is just getting the revenue of having these guys on the court. Now, several factors as to why maybe not all of these stars have been on the court for the Brooklyn Nets. But where do you think Brooklyn ranks in terms of fan attendance this past season in the NBA overall before I give you their crosstown rival, the Knicks?
Well, I mean, that is a little unfair because I read this. But I would encourage fans right now to guess where they think it is because I know, and I'll give you the background on it. It's a situation where we know the Nets had tons of sellouts. They had super high engagement this year from a fan base. This was reported sellouts most nights. We know Brooklyn Brigade was getting hyped up, dapped up on some of these talk shows. I mean, there's a rabid fan base here for sure. Anyone that's going to say Brooklyn doesn't have a fan base is just not paying attention. So I don't really know what else to tell you there. But I do know the numbers, and when I first read it, I was surprised by this.
Yeah, and again, right. So just to be clear, because fans of this podcast are fans of the Brooklyn Nets, like the fan base is rabid and it's there, but they were 13th in the NBA overall, and that marks them a handful of spots behind the 8th placed ranked New York Knicks, who had high expectations coming in and basically fell off the cliff pretty early on. Their season got off the rails in a hurry here. And while things were not perfect for Brooklyn, this is another factor, I think, inside of this equation, because we just talked about playoff numbers. Listen, sellouts matter, selling tickets matter. And while it may feel marginal, when you go inside these numbers, the best team in the league, by the way, the Chicago Bulls, 20,000, almost 21,000 average game attendance. The Nets are there at 17,354. Like, that's 3,000 seats. That's 3,000 tickets. That's multiply it by the average ticket sale number over 41 games. That plays a role here too. And I only bring it up to say, as we'll get into the impact on these players, that even in what feels like should be some of the better years here with some of the bigger names, the Nets are still struggling. As much as anything, the off the court stuff and some of the personalities on this team have had an impact on that, I think. But you have Kevin Durant. You had him for the bulk of this season, and yet you're still not trending among the top teams in the league.
And I'll get to the players here in a second. And some of that's just capacity, right? Like,
yep.
Brooklyn is the 5th smallest arena in terms of overall capacity. They sit 3,000 seats smaller than the Bulls. So that's just going to be a numbers thing. It's not like the Bulls. It's not like maybe that the Nets wouldn't have drawn those numbers. It's just they numbers aren't in. They're not in the stadium, right? The stadium is just 3,000 fewer seats in general. So
and that puts them 9th, by the way, overall based on percentage. So they're 9th overall in the league on percentage capacity, which is the better way to frame it, to your point. Different arenas, different seat sizes, still 9th, which, okay, you're top 10, but arguably you have 2 or 3 at points of this season of the top 15 players in the NBA. I would assume Joe Tsai expects for us to be top 5 when we're talking about ticket sales.
All right, so here we are with an offseason and why you need to be concerned. The Nets already have Kevin Durant under contract. They have Ben Simmons, $34 million under contract. Joe Harris, 18.6, and then they have Seth Curry at 8.5, which is looking like an incredible deal at this point. They have Kyrie coming up for a player extension. He has a player option in his contract. It's by all accounts, at least right now, he's going to decline that and sign a max offer. We'll see. They have Patty Mills with a player option at $6 million too. Not sure about that. And then they got basically the rookies, who they all are converted to contracts now because of what they did at the end of the season. That leaves a lot of spots on the roster, and specifically 2 guys that are definitely going to make more than they did last year. In Bruce Brown, who only made 4.7. That number is going to go way up based on the performance for him last year. And Nick Claxton, who was making 1.8 last year, that number is definitely going to go up almost just no matter what. So if they re-sign Kyrie, that's 100% going up. Claxton and Bruce Brown definitely going up. And then you just got to round out the rest of the roster. They've been doing the dumpster diving on the veteran minimum stuff for a while now, or just min guys in general. We see how that worked out, kind of like, where you can you get called a little early on that. And this is a team that was already well into the luxury tax. Every dollar spent now is not 1 for 1 for the Nets, right? It is not $1 to sign a player and $1 spent. It's $1 to sign a player and then like $2.5 to $3 more because you got to pay the penalty and the luxury tax. This has to be a major concern for Nets fans right now, because if we are already having little warning shots around not having enough money or losing money, is there a world where they are just going to go open the checkbook for all these guys that they might need to bring back? I don't see how it's even possible if this is what they're already going to start operating with. Bruce Brown, Nick Claxton, again, just filling out the rest of the bench with anybody else, like warm bodies that can play. This is a precarious spot for the Nets, and I'm almost starting to feel like I need to prepare myself for a scenario where A, some of these guys just don't come back because they claim they can't afford them, and B, we really start dumpster diving for players because they need to just round out the rest of the roster with as cheap options as possible. I'm not saying it's going to go that way, but when you start to read this stuff at this point in the season, you have to start worrying.
Yeah, I mean, you like to think, they catch some benefit. LaMarcus Aldridge could very well retire, maybe Blake Griffin as well. Unfortunately, pretty low veteran minimum contracts that you have on the books there. The other guy would be Patty Mills, to say player option for him. Maybe, behind the scenes, are they like, maybe somewhere else might be a little bit better for you. Maybe greener pastures for you, Patty, because even the $6 million alone, when you have $8 million tied into value in Seth Curry and 18 on Joe Harris, that's the interesting thing that we'll see here going on in the background. It does feel like, as we'll talk about what it could be setting the stage for here in a second, these rookies, these young players, you're going to look and go, yeah, Yeah, those are the guys, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying right, wrong, and different. We'll talk about them in the offseason. But Cam Thomas, Daveron Sharp, Kessler Edwards, strap on the boots, fellas, because you are going to have to play significant roles based on what we maybe need to read on the tea leaves here as well. So it's fascinating, man, because it's very rare that the Nets are in a circumstance like this, because usually when you invest this much money, what ends up happening is you win. And then once you win, it justifies either spending again and doubling down on the process, or you get to kind of reboot the thing and not feel the level of pressure or scrutiny around it because you already did the thing, you know, the mission accomplished of getting a championship. Instead, the Nets haven't done that. They have big money on the books and big question marks in a couple of the key players while still standing there and going, and I don't know if it's ever going to work out the way we need it to. At least we need to go into next season saying, if I'm Joe Tsai, deep playoff run, I need the 12 home games and maybe more. And nothing about what this roster currently has suggests that that's a guarantee. It's actually far more likely, we said at the top there, give me 12 postseason games. Well, out of a possible 36 over the last 3 years, you've had 5. So, you know, or 5, 6 games, six
Right.
home postseason games, right? So the ratio, the math does not add up there, which should be interesting here. In a second, basically, we'll tell you what this could be setting the stage for here this offseason, and why maybe the conversations we were having around Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, and other key players on this roster, it's going to start to crystallize in a hurry here if Joe Tsai starts to put his foot down around the dollars being spent and ultimately the return on his investment. First, got to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, because they are your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You get over there right now, my friends, and lay 7.5 with the Miami Heat beating the 76ers. I don't need to explain why Brooklyn Nets fans want the 76ers to lose. It's all very well and understood. BetOnline.net, of course, has all the latest sports developments, the league reviews, the news, the info, the big off-season impact. You're going to see that in the betting lines over there on BetOnline.net, of course, all throughout the basketball playoffs and as Major League Baseball continues to get underway. It's your continued source for all that sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to hear about all the latest trends in action. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. So where we start then, Doug, is with all of this information in front of us, what is this setting the stage for here this offseason? I mean, like you say, the article doesn't come out of nowhere. It's clearly a message from Joe Tsai. And one thing we didn't touch on in this article is heads are rolling here inside of the organization. Joe Tsai has done a lot of movement here around who's running, who's making decisions, both from a basketball standpoint and then from a what's known as Barclays entertainment standpoint. And I'll throw up this quote, which is just from a sports banker close, we think, ties to the situation, who said, Joe is hands-on, hard driving, and if you don't fit with that, then he will go until he finds the person that fits. What is this? I mean, this is all terribly doom and gloom. Can we have nice things? Can we just have nice things?
Well, yeah. So the other funny thing it's not funny. The other interesting thing not even hidden, that thrown out in this piece was the reminder about how often Joe Tsai fires people. And now we have not experienced this with the Nets so far. Outside of Kenny Atkinson, which I want to believe was not really a Tsai decision. So we can remove that one. But they did spend a lot of time in this piece talking about his relationship with sort of the chief C-suite kind of executives dealing at Barclays. The latest one was the former CEO of Barclays Entertainment, Joe Abamandi, who was let go after these numbers, after basically Barclays Center failed to provide any revenue at all as a company, right? So he was in charge of that. There's a number of different references to why that happened, not being data driven enough, not really seeing opportunities to take advantage of. The bottom line here is that they go through him having let Abamandi go. They also go through a number of other people in those positions that he has quickly let go when the results haven't been there. I couldn't see this as anything more than a veiled, not a threat, but a veiled reminder that, hey, you also, Nets folks, have a job to do. And if the results aren't going to be there, we can just go find someone else to try to get the results. That was the first thing I read. All the reminders around who had been let go within the Barclays organization, I felt like I could have just said, hey, Sean Marks, just as a reminder, it seems like you've done a good job, right? We've agreed with a lot of the decisions. But in the end, there's only really one thing that matters, and that's winning at a really high level. we are now on year X of that not having happened. Yes, there's been lots of other stuff that's happened. I get, but at some point, you just have to win. And if the thing you're building isn't winning, we have to just go find someone who does, who can. And I couldn't help but see that entire exchange or the entire list of all the people that are getting fired from Barclays as being like, who is next to be on the chopping block? Someone within the Nets organization.
Well, that's what. So this is my question then, because you mentioned Sean Marks. Obviously, that's GM of the Brooklyn Nets. He's the first one that you would think, hey, you haven't gotten me the results. The curiosity I have around Joe Tsai and the way he thinks at it is, do you look at the numbers and the decision-making process and say, okay, here is a person that was responsible for X, Y, and Z, and it hasn't panned out? Or in this scenario, are you looking at Sean Marks and saying you have failed to make this successful? Or do you go a layer deeper down to Steve Nash and say you have failed? Or do you go down a layer deeper to the players and examine who has been a part of the success or who has been right, wrong, indifferent, a component of the issues that we suffered from here? And I'll go back to the top where, again, just the math on it that Joe Tsai is doing around what level of product do I put on the court that gets X number of attendance and returns money on my investment where I make the most money. Like you're dividing two things here around businessman Joe Tsai and sports fan Joe Tsai. Does sports fan Joe Tsai want to see the team win? Yes, he does. But does businessman Joe Tsai say, I also want to maximize the amount of money that I make off of this product? Like, that's the interesting thing. Kevin Durant's not going anywhere. He's always going to be a draw. You said Sean Marks. Like, I also take this as meaning if he still believes, let's assume he does believe in Sean Marks and the job that he does. If he turns around and says this thing needs to be more successful and we need to spend our money, better. If Sean Marks turned around and said that path that we talked about on a previous episode around Kyrie Irving, then it means we need to do X, Y, and Z. We need to get rid of Kyrie Irving, get rid of Ben Simmons. We need to shed all this money and build around Kevin Durant and live with the fallout that could come from that. Like, do you think that it goes that deep?
No, I don't think that, because I think for the most part, sports is pretty undefeated in that you can't fire the players. That's the one group of people you really can't fire, especially when you can trade them.
But rare occasions where you have players, like Kyrie Irving that have somewhat of a measurable one-to-one impact on the success or failure of your franchise over the last 3 seasons, right?
Yeah, the counter to that, I agree with you, and I know we just did a huge 2-part episode about this. The counter to that is, like, they could never sign the devil's bargain is you can never sign someone as good as him for the money it would take to spend because you already have him here, and so you'll never get one-to-one value on it. We already discussed you never get anything close to one-to-one talent level value on a trade of him either, and so it's just you're just an impossible spot when it comes to these guys, I think. So I think, and that's it. Just real quick too, going back to where you go organizationally, I don't think. I think let's assume the players are going to be the players because that's usually what happens in sports. So let's forget the Nets part of this. Just usually what happens is you have the players that you have, right? Like, that's it. Now, how you came to get those players can be called into question, and this is where you look at Sean Marks and saying, "Hey, maybe we made the wrong decisions to start around some of these guys, mm-hmm. right? Like, maybe that's
right.
More
that's right. We're stuck with them now, but
we have them now. But you brought them in, you brought them in, and there was a vouching for it, and that's what it is. And I just think in the end, it kind of doesn't matter. It's if you're success driven and you're data driven, like Tsai is or claims to be, then it's actually just super binary. It's either you win and you stay, or you lose and you leave. and that's it. It's basically comes down to pretty much ones and zeros. It actually at that point doesn't matter. Well, COVID, who cares? Everyone dealt with COVID.
Right.
Like,
say, yeah.
Injuries, great. Everyone deals with injuries. Like, you can't use those as, if you're running an organization, you cannot use those as, or you can't use them forever. I would say, like, you can use them maybe at the a little bit, but you can't use those little externalities forever, because at some point everyone deals with external stuff, injuries, BS, player personalities, like whatever it is that stops players from performing at their best. Literally every team deals with this. So some deal with it better than others, but in the end, you can just point to that and say, great, everyone deals with that stuff. You're fired. I think that's, we might be looking at that.
Yeah, as a GM, you can Sean Marks can give those explanations from a basketball perspective, right? We've dealt with these things, the impact. It doesn't mean it's going to save his job forever, but you can do those things. Joe Tsai, that's a layer lower on Joe Tsai's totem pole of, like, the factors that impact this being successful or not. Like, I need to know that this is a successful product based on the people I put in place to run it. It's an arm of my media empire. It's an arm of things that make me money. I need not worry about the external factors that impacted that being successful. I just need to know whether or not I still have the confidence in this case, Sean Marks, to execute that. I will say, it'll be interesting to see as we work our way through this summer here around. I'll keep coming back to it because if he is a dollar and cents man, and if Sean Marks is approaching it from both sides of that line, I'll go back to it. It's like these players equal X number of dollars and these players equal X number of dollars. What do you think? Because now what we do have here is a sample size at the very least from when you have invested heavily in the superstar talent and then surrounded them with average, mediocre veteran players. And we've had some nice things mixed in here. We have seen what the results have been. Even if it hasn't been a perfect process getting there, we've seen some playoff results that suggest this version of it isn't good enough to get us the 12 home games or more that gets you more money, Joe. So that's, I think, the ratio that we'll hear them discuss. I think their options are obviously limited, but this is to the point. This is a message being sent.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe it will be the final year, right? Going into this one about it's do or die for a lot of people around this organization, top to bottom. So fun stuff for the Brooklyn Nets as we work our way through.
And I was going to close on that. I don't think anyone's being let go now. I think that this is the end of the line. Like, this season is it. And not only might this season be it, but we might not fire every bullet either. Like, we might go, because if we're not going to go and spend, but you're also expected to perform, that's going to be a double, difficult bottom line to deal with, because there's a world where it says you're on the chopping block and we're not just going 50 million into the tax for you to do it. Like, you're going to need to kind of work some other angles here to be able to get out of it. And I think that's going to be a really interesting piece that we're going to probably end up just watching play out in real time.
And ironically enough, something that like Sean Marks arguably proved when he first got the job is now going to be, now go reprove it. Now go reprove it again. Because now we're 3 years away from that big rebuild that you accomplished here to make it attractive for stars. Now go show me that the stars are in place and you're a little bit hamstrung and you can still be successful. So it definitely is going to make for an interesting process here moving forward for the Nets.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Like I said, pretty sure we're going to have Chris Mulholland from Nets Daily on tomorrow. Talk everything that's the offseason. We'll get into some of this stuff too, but we're going to do a full breakdown on the season that just was, his thoughts on covering the team for the whole year. So look for that on your podcast and YouTube coming the rest of this week. In the meantime, like I said, go and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll be churning out content for the entire off season as well. I'll put the links for those in the show notes.
And of course, friends, you made us your first listen of the day. Please make the second listen Locked On NBA, from the first jump ball of the play-in tournament all the way to the last possession of the finals. Locked On experts take you deep inside the playoffs with insights and analysis affecting all 30 teams. Go enjoy it wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. And hey, friends, whether it's making money or winning games, if you can accept losing, you can't win. Vinny Lombardi.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.